In the peaceful, rural county of Madison, Iowa, where sprawling cornfields are interspersed with fruitful orchards, lived a small family often seen as a shining example of a real-life fairy tale. This was the family of Mark Peterson, 42, and his wife Laura, 39. They were not just a hard-working couple with a knack for farming, but they were also respected by the entire community for their benevolent hearts. Married for many years, they were unable to have children of their own. Instead of sinking into sorrow, they decided to open their arms and adopt unfortunate orphan children, giving them a home and a future. The Peterson house was always filled with the sound of laughter. They treated their adopted children no differently than biological ones, caring for their every need, from meals and sleep to their education. The image of Mark, a man with a rugged appearance, toiling in the fields and then returning in the evening to carry an adopted child on his back for a walk around the village, or the image of the gentle Laura Spoon feeding a child, had become familiar and admirable in the eyes of their neighbors. People often remarked that while heaven may not have granted them biological children, it had bestowed upon them the hearts of saints. But then, a horrifying tragedy struck, completely shattering that perfect facade and exposing a truth so cruel it was beyond imagination. On a scorching summer afternoon in late 2020, the entire village was shaken by desperate, mournful cries coming from the Petersons' house. When the first neighbors ran over, they were frozen by a heartbreaking scene. Laura Peterson was kneeling beside a small puddle of water near an old, rusty pump in the corner of the garden, cradling the lifeless, discolored body of their third adopted child, Daniel Clark, a bright and incredibly lovely 4-year-old boy. Mark Peterson stood stiffly beside her, his face ashen, his eyes staring blankly into the distance. Laura's cries tore through the air as she lamented how her child could leave his parents like this. She wailed that she had told him so many times not to play near the pump and asked why he had not listened. The story of the tragedy spread quickly. According to the couple's fragmented account, while they were working inside, young Daniel had run out to play in the garden alone. Perhaps out of curiosity, he had tampered with the old water pump, which had long been broken and had a faulty electrical connection. A tragic accident occurred. By the time Mark and Laura discovered him, it was too late. Local law enforcement soon arrived at the scene. It seemed to be a clear-cut accident. An old, rusted water pump with sections of its electrical cord gnawed by rodents, exposing the plastic insulation, lay beside a small puddle. The child's body showed no signs of external force, only a few faint burn marks on his small hand, entirely consistent with an electric shock. The testimony of the grief-stricken couple was also completely logical. They blamed themselves for their carelessness, for not repairing or discarding the broken pump, leading to an irreversible consequence. The couple's performance of overwhelming grief was utterly convincing to everyone. People not only believed them but felt immense sympathy for them. They pitied the unfortunate child and pitied the kind-hearted couple even more. After so many years of longing for a child, they had adopted and loved them, only to face such a devastating loss. No one, not even for a fleeting moment, could doubt their sincerity. The local authorities quickly concluded that Daniel Clark's death was a regrettable accident caused by adult negligence in managing dangerous electrical equipment. The case file was closed amidst the boundless sorrow of the entire rural community. The boy's funeral was held shortly after. Mark and Laura, dressed in mourning clothes, cried until they fainted beside their adopted son's casket. They tormented themselves, blaming themselves for what happened. This image only deepened the respect and sorrow of those around them. The incident seemed destined to fade into memory, like so many other tragic accidents that occur in rural areas. About a month later, when the pain seemed to have begun to subside in the eyes of the public, Mark and Laura Peterson quietly submitted a file to the office of a major life insurance company with a branch in Des Moines. It was a claim for the insurance benefits on the policy they had purchased for their late adopted son, Daniel Clark. The claim amount was $750,000. The file landed on the desk of David Miller, an insurance claims adjuster with over 20 years of experience in the field. He was known for his caution, meticulousness, and a sharp professional eye, capable of sniffing out the slightest signs of fraud. As he read through the Petersons' file, Mr. Miller initially saw it as a typical, tragic accident. But a few small details made the veteran adjuster raise an eyebrow. First, the policy value of $750,000 was a very large sum for a 4-year-old child, especially in a rural area. Typically, parents would buy health insurance or policies with modest cumulative values for their children. Purchasing a life insurance policy with such a high payout for a child was quite unusual. Second, the timing of the purchase was also very suspicious. The policy was signed just 1 month after the Petersons completed the legal procedures to adopt Daniel, and only a few months before the accident occurred. It felt more like a calculated investment than a long-term plan to protect the child's future. And the final detail, the one that made Mr. Miller feel the most uneasy, was the premium. To secure a death benefit of $750,000, the monthly premium the Petersons had to pay was not insignificant and seemed disproportionate to the income of a couple engaged purely in farming. Professional instinct told Mr. Miller that something was not right. He could not ignore these unusual ripples. Instead of relying solely on the local police report, he decided to conduct a deeper investigation himself. And his first, and most decisive, step was to check the couple's claim history across the entire company system and its affiliates. He opened the internal search system on his computer, a high-security software. He entered Mark Peterson's social security number, then Laura Peterson's, and clicked search. The system began scanning millions of records. A few seconds later, the results appeared, and what was displayed on the screen made the seasoned professional hold his breath. The system returned not one, but 3 major life insurance policies linked to this couple. Daniel Clark's policy was merely the most recent one. The system history showed that 2 other policies had already been settled, with the insurance benefits successfully paid out. Mr. Miller's hand trembled as he clicked on the first claim file. The date was May 2017. The insured was Ethan White, age 3, an adopted son. The cause of death was accidental drowning. The attached local police report concluded that the boy had accidentally slipped and fallen into the fish pond behind the house while playing and drowned. The beneficiaries were Mark Peterson and Laura Peterson. The amount paid was $1 million. A chill ran down Mr. Miller's spine. An adopted child, an accident, a huge insurance payout. The coincidences were starting to become terrifying. He proceeded to open the second file. The date was July 2018, just over a year after the first incident. The insured was Jacob Green, age 5, also an adopted son. The cause of death was an accidental fall into a well. The police report also concluded it was a tragic accident. The Petersons' testimony stated that the old well cover behind the house had rotted. Jacob, while playing, stepped on it and fell through. The beneficiaries were Mark Peterson and Laura Peterson. The amount paid this time was even larger, $1.5 million. By now, Mr. Miller could no longer sit still. He shot up from his chair, his hands pressed against the desk, his eyes wide as he stared at the computer screen. A horrifying pattern, a chillingly clear and undeniable formula of death, had emerged. About every year or so, this couple would adopt an orphan. About every year or so, they would buy that child a life insurance policy of enormous value. And about every year or so, that child would die in a tragic accident without a single suspicious mark. And after each death, a multi-million-dollar insurance payment would be transferred into their account. Ethan White drowned for $1 million. Jacob Green fell down a well for $1.5 million. And now, Daniel Clark was electrocuted for $750,000. This was not a coincidence. This was not a cruel twist of fate. This was a series of serial murders, meticulously and coldly planned, concealed beneath a facade of crocodile tears and feigned benevolence. The unfortunate orphans who should have found a loving home had instead been turned into tools, sacrificial lambs for the couple's bottomless greed. Mark and Laura Peterson were not saints, they were demons in human disguise. Rage welled up inside Mr. Miller but was immediately replaced by the calm, decisive mind of a professional. He knew that what he was about to do was not just deny an insurance claim, it was to expose one of the most horrific crimes he had ever encountered. His actions had to be extremely cautious. If he flatly refused the claim and stated his reasons, the demonic couple would surely become suspicious and try to flee or destroy any remaining evidence. He sat down and drafted a response letter to Mark and Laura Peterson. The letter was professional and objective. It stated that after reviewing the file, the company had noted a few unclear points in the scene report. It explained that the company required additional time to conduct an independent review before a final decision could be made, and that their claim was temporarily denied. It was a technical reason, just enough to buy time without startling the 2 cunning foxes. After sending the letter, Mr. Miller immediately locked his office door. He did not report the matter to his direct supervisor through the usual channels, fearing the information might leak. He took out his personal cell phone and found a number in his contacts that he had saved long ago, a number he hoped he would never have to use. It was the personal cell phone of an old friend who now held an important position in the Criminal Investigations Division of the Madison County Sheriff's Office. Keeping his voice from trembling, Mr. Miller identified himself to his friend Marcus. He explained that he was David Miller from the insurance company and had a special, extremely serious case. He stated that it was not the usual insurance fraud he suspected, it was a serial murder case. The phone call from David Miller, the insurance adjuster, to the Madison County Sheriff's Office was like a bomb exploding in the midst of a feigned peace. The content of the call, with its information about a chillingly repetitive pattern of death, was immediately reported to the sheriff's senior command. The gravity of the case, with the suspicion of a series of serial murders targeting children for insurance money, left even the most experienced law enforcement leaders shocked and outraged. A special task force, designated as one of the year's most critical cases, was immediately formed. Detective Sergeant Marcus Thorne, an investigator known for his decisiveness, sharp logical thinking, and experience in solving complex cases, was appointed to lead it. In the first emergency meeting with his team, Detective Thorne stated that this was no ordinary case. He described how they were dealing with two demons in human disguise, individuals capable of maintaining a perfect act for years. He pointed out that they had deceived local authorities, neighbors, and even initial investigators not once, but 3 times. This, he explained, showed they were extremely intelligent, cunning, and cold-blooded. He stressed that every action they took from that moment on had to be conducted in absolute secrecy to prevent the subjects from having any suspicion. The investigation plan was meticulously laid out. The first and most crucial step was to reinvestigate and re-examine the scenes of all 3 accidents. The task force needed to find physical evidence, flaws in the script the killers had created, to build a solid legal basis for their next moves. The first line of inquiry targeted the most recent incident, the death of Daniel Clark by electrocution. A team, including Detective Thorne, investigators, and the best experts from the forensics unit, secretly returned to the Petersons' home. This time, they did not come as sympathizers but as truth seekers. Under the guise of being utility company employees checking the electrical safety system after the accident, the team easily gained access to the scene in the garden without raising any suspicion from the 2 subjects. The old water pump, the centerpiece of the incident, was still lying there. This examination was completely different from the initial one by the local deputies. The forensic experts began their work with specialized equipment. They did not just look with the naked eye but used high magnification lenses, resistance meters, and microscopic analysis. And it did not take them long to find the fatal anomaly. An expert called the sergeant over, saying they had a problem. He pointed to the electrical cord leading to the pump, explaining that the cord was not chewed by rodents or worn out naturally. Detective Thorne knelt to inspect it. At the spot on the cord that supposedly caused the fatal shock, the outer plastic insulation was stripped away, exposing the copper wire inside. But under a magnifying glass, the strip section had very strange characteristics. It lacked the jagged bite marks of a rodent. It also showed no signs of the brittle cracking of aged material. Instead, the edge of the plastic insulation was sharp and clean, as if cut by a sharp object, and on the surface of the copper wire were tiny parallel scratches. The expert confirmed that it was the mark of a knife. Someone had intentionally used a small, sharp knife to strip this section of insulation, creating an exposed electrical trap. It was a deliberate act, not an accident. The first piece of evidence of a staged murder had been found. The story of a faulty old pump had completely collapsed. Not stopping there, the team moved to the scene of the second accident, the well where Jacob Green had supposedly fallen to his death. The well, located at the far end of the garden, had been abandoned for a long time. The Petersons' initial statement claimed that the well cover, made of wooden planks, had rotted. Jacob, while playing, had stepped on it and fallen through. But when the investigators examined the site, they discovered a completely different truth. The current well cover had been replaced with a solid concrete slab. However, fragments of the old wooden cover, the supposed cause of the accident, were still discarded in a corner of the garden. The experts carefully collected these wood fragments, and once again, the killer's deception was exposed. The wood showed no signs of internal rot, as is common with wood left outdoors for years. On the contrary, The grain was still quite solid. But on their surface were numerous chopping marks from a sharp tool, as if someone had deliberately tried to make them look weak. And upon examining the nail holes in the planks, the experts found that the wood fibers around the holes were very fresh, indicating that the nails had only recently been driven in loosely, not as part of a structure that had existed for years. An investigator concluded that it was a fabricated well cover. The killer had deliberately created a deadly trap. They had weakened the structure of the cover and likely lured the child to play near it, waiting for the accident to happen. 2 of the 3 accidents had been proven to be elaborately staged murders. As for the first case, the drowning of Ethan White, too much time had passed, and the scene, a fish pond, had undergone many changes, making it nearly impossible to find physical evidence. However, given the deadly pattern established by the subsequent 2 cases, the task force had sufficient grounds to believe it was also a homicide, the first link in the Petersons' heinous chain of crimes. While the reinvestigation was being conducted in secret, back at their home, Mark and Laura Peterson were beginning to feel uneasy. They had just received the temporary denial letter from the insurance company. Mark growled, crumpling the letter in his hand, asking what kind of game the company was playing. He complained that the file was complete and the police had already closed the case, so he did not understand why they needed to reinvestigate. Laura, her voice trembling, asked if he thought they suspected something. Mark snapped back, questioning what there was to suspect. He insisted that everything was planned perfectly, without a single flaw. It had worked the first 2 times, and it would work this time. He dismissed it as bureaucratic red tape and told her to wait and see, warning her not to act scared. Though they tried to reassure each other, anxiety had begun to envelop the 2 killers. They had no idea that the net of justice was already tightening and that ironclad evidence of their crimes had been found. Back at the sheriff's office, with initial evidence that the scenes were tampered with, Detective Thorne decided it was time for the next step in the investigation, a step that would uncover the entire motive for the crimes. In a case meeting, he stated that they had evidence that these were murders. Now, he said, they had to answer the question of why. He questioned what 3 innocent children, 3 lives, were sacrificed for. The answer, he was certain, lay in the numbers, in the $2.5 million in insurance money they had already received and the $750,000 they were trying to get now. He turned to the head of the Economic Crimes Unit and requested that his team, using all available means, subpoena and analyze the complete flow of money in all of Mark and Laura Peterson's bank accounts for the last 5 years. He wanted to know where that enormous amount of insurance money went and whether their real life was as prosperous as it appeared on the surface. He was convinced that the motive for the crimes was hidden in those bank transactions. While Mark and Laura Peterson were living in a state of anxious limbo, torn between regretting the suspended $750,000 insurance payment and reassuring themselves that everything was under control, another silent investigation was underway at the Madison County Sheriff's Office, a comprehensive financial autopsy. This phase, led by the Economic Crimes Unit, had a single mission: to follow the money and expose the true financial face of the demonic couple. Under Detective Thorne's direction, economic investigators, in collaboration with cybercrime units and commercial banks, subpoenaed the complete transaction histories of all bank accounts registered to Mark and Laura Peterson over the past 5 years. It was a massive amount of data, with thousands of transactions large and small, but the experts missed nothing. Using specialized analysis software, they created a detailed money flow chart, highlighting unusual transactions and suspicious expenditures. And when the complete financial picture of the Petersons emerged, it stunned the entire task force. It was not the picture of a simple, hard-working farming couple living a frugal life. It was a financial abyss, a frantic vortex of debt, gambling, and huge sums of money from unknown sources. The analysis showed that the cash flow in their accounts followed a terrifyingly repetitive cycle, a cycle that perfectly matched the deaths of their adopted children. Before the death of Ethan White in early 2017, Mark and Laura's accounts were nearly empty. They had numerous small debts to relatives and friends, and several loans from predatory lenders. Their total debt amounted to tens of thousands of dollars. Their life was clearly in a state of financial distress, buried under a mountain of debt. But then, a sudden change occurred right after Ethan's death. A massive sum of $1 million from the insurance company was transferred into Mark Peterson's account. And strangely, this money was not used for business investments, major asset purchases, or savings. Within a few months, the entire $1 million had vanished. The money trail showed it was broken down into smaller amounts, transferred to dozens of different personal accounts, and from there, disappeared without a trace. That cycle repeated itself precisely in 2018. Before the death of Jacob Green, the Petersons were once again drowning in debt. But this time, the debts were much larger, reaching hundreds of thousands of dollars. And then, after Jacob fell down the well, another $1.5 million from an insurance company flowed into their account. And just like the first time, in less than half a year, that $1.5 million also vanished, funneled through a complex network of intermediary accounts. The evaporation of these huge sums could only be explained by one possibility: money laundering. But laundering money for what activity? To answer this question, the cybercrime unit stepped in. They traced the intermediary accounts that received money from the Petersons, and the final truth was laid bare. All of those accounts were shell accounts used as payment gateways for a series of large-scale online gambling websites with servers located overseas. The motive for the crime was now exposed in its rawest, clearest form. Mark and Laura Peterson were not ordinary farmers. They were severe gambling addicts. Their facade of kindness and benevolence was just an elaborate act to hide a life steeped in betting and debt. They were no longer capable of earning money through labor. Their only path to cash was murder. Their entire monstrous plan became clear. They adopted orphans, helpless beings with no one to turn to. They treated them well, creating an image of a happy family to deceive the neighbors. But in parallel, they secretly purchased high-value life insurance policies for them. And when their debts came due, when their gambling addiction reached its peak, they would ruthlessly murder the very children they called their own, staging perfect accidents to calmly collect enormous insurance payouts. That money was not used to build a better life. It was thrown into online bets, only to evaporate quickly, and a new cycle of crime would begin. In their eyes, the children were not human beings. They were just chips in a bloody poker game. In the final case meeting, Detective Thorne, his voice tight with fury, announced that they had everything. They had evidence of the staged scenes, the repetitive pattern of death, and now a motive that could not be clearer. It was time, he said, to end this play. A detailed plan for the arrest and interrogation of Mark and Laura Peterson was drawn up. The task force decided against a sudden arrest. They would summon both of them for questioning, separate them, and use the collected evidence to break down their layers of deception and lies, one by one, forcing them to confront their unforgivable crimes. The summons was delivered to Mark and Laura Peterson's house one morning. This time, the reason was no longer for cooperation. The summons clearly requested Mr. Mark Peterson and Mrs. Laura Peterson to appear at the Madison County Sheriff's Office to be questioned regarding circumstances related to the deaths of Ethan White, Jacob Green, and Daniel Clark. Upon receiving the summons with the three names of their three adopted children listed so clearly, Mark and Laura knew their act was finally over. The color drained from their faces, and sheer panic was evident in their eyes. They did not say a word to each other, just silently changed their clothes. They knew that this trip to the sheriff's office would be a one-way journey. The net of the law, after so many years, had finally closed. The final confrontation with Mark and Laura Peterson was conducted simultaneously in two separate interrogation rooms. The task force had prepared a detailed interrogation script, aiming not only to force them to admit their guilt but also to clarify the specific roles and actions of each suspect in every case. Investigators predicted that, true to the nature of gambling addicts facing collapse, they would likely try to blame and betray each other to save themselves. Laura Peterson, the woman with the deceptively fragile appearance, was brought into the first interrogation room. Detective Sergeant Thorne sat directly across from her. Initially, Laura tried to maintain her role as a grieving mother, weeping and claiming that summoning her to discuss the three children she had lost was an insult, a cruel act by the investigators. She sobbed that they could not do this to her. She insisted that they had lost their children, a pain that was already too much, and questioned why the investigators were bringing it all up again and suspecting them. Detective Thorne did not argue. He just silently placed the three insurance files for the three unfortunate children on the table. Next to them was a thick stack of bank statements. He began, his voice calm but heavy, telling Laura that they were not suspecting they had proof. He laid out the facts: 3 children, 3 accidents, and a total of $3.25 million in insurance money paid or pending. He asked if she did not think this coincidence was a little too perfect. He pushed the stack of bank statements towards her, explaining that it showed where all the money went, hundreds of transfers to personal accounts, and from there, straight into online gambling sites. He asked her to explain why the money meant to compensate for the pain of losing a child was used to fuel all-night gambling sprees. Faced with the irrefutable financial evidence, Laura Peterson's act began to crumble. She stopped crying, her face went pale, and her hands twisted in her lap. She claimed not to know, stating that her husband managed all the money and that she knew nothing, beginning her first attempt to shift the blame. Detective Thorne continued, asking if that was so. He then placed photos of the intentionally stripped electrical wire and the doctored well cover on the table, asking if she also knew nothing about them. He pointed out that they had the forensic report, which proved these were not accidents but deliberately set traps. He questioned whether she was going to claim that her husband did all of this alone, while she, a mother who supposedly loved her children so dearly, was completely unaware. Each piece of evidence, each sharp argument from Detective Thorne, was like a sledgehammer blow to Laura Peterson's psyche. She knew there was no way out, no room for denial. Silence filled the room. And then, she completely broke down. The crying this time was not an act, it was the sound of fear and defeat. She screamed that it was him, that it was all Mark. She claimed he was the gambling addict, buried in debt, and that the horrible plan was his idea. She insisted he said it was the only way to get money to pay off the debts and win it back. She claimed she tried to stop him, that she begged him, but he would not listen. She said he threatened her and forced her to go along with it, pleading that she was just a weak woman and asking what she could have done. Laura's confession, though calculated, was the first admission that confirmed the existence of a serial murder plot. The task force had gotten what they needed from the weakest link. Meanwhile, in the adjacent interrogation room, Mark Peterson proved to be much more stubborn. He remained silent, neither admitting nor denying anything. He sat there with a defiant, hardened expression. But when investigators informed him that Laura had confessed everything and had pinned all the blame on him as the mastermind, Mark's composure finally shattered. He roared, furious, questioning how that bitch dared to say that. He countered that she was the one who suggested it, who had said they should try their luck one more time after a big loss. The rage of betrayal made Mark abandon his silence. He decided he would not go down alone. He began to talk, and his confession was even colder and more detailed than his wife's, recreating the entire criminal process in chilling detail. He admitted to being the one who planned and directly carried out all 3 murders. With Ethan White, on one afternoon, he had intentionally invited the boy to the pond's edge to throw stones. When no one was around, he pretended to slip and deliberately shoved the child hard, pushing him into the deep water. He made no attempt to save him, simply standing on the bank, coldly watching until the child stopped struggling before he started screaming for help. With Jacob Green, the plan was more elaborate. He spent a whole day creating the death trap well cover. He intentionally sawed through the load-bearing wooden beams almost completely, then loosely nailed them back together. He then lured Jacob to play hide and seek near the well, deliberately creating situations where the boy would have to run across the cover. The tragedy unfolded exactly as he had calculated. And finally, with Daniel Clark, he created an electrical trap. He used a knife to strip the insulation from a section of the pump's cord and plugged it in. He knew Daniel was an active and curious child, fascinated by machinery. All he had to do was leave the pump there and wait. He did not even need to be at the scene when the accident happened. Mark confessed coldly that Laura did not physically do it, but she agreed to it. He stated that she was the one who acted, who cried her eyes out to fool everyone. She was the one who went with him to withdraw the insurance money and throw it at the gambling sites. He concluded that her guilt was the same as his. The entire truth was exposed, from the mouths of the 2 killers themselves. A horrifying story of human depravity, of how greed and a gambling addiction had turned 2 people, 2 adoptive parents, into soulless demons. With the detailed and cold-blooded confessions from both Mark and Laura Peterson, coupled with an irrefutable system of scientific and financial evidence, the investigation phase of the case officially concluded. A case file, hundreds of pages thick, detailing the entire criminal enterprise from the adoption of the first child to the death of the final victim, was completed by the Madison County Sheriff's Office and forwarded to the District Attorney's Office. After a period of review, the Madison County DA's office issued an indictment, charging both defendants, Mark Peterson and Laura Peterson, with murder, to be tried before the district court. The indictment identified it as an organized, serial murder case with the base motive of financial gain. The aggravating factors justifying the highest penalty were listed clearly and forcefully: multiple homicides, murder of a person under 16, and the commission of the crime in a cruel, calculated manner. A few months later, the trial began. The case of the benevolent couple who were secretly demons, murdering 3 adopted children for insurance money, sent shockwaves through the state and the entire country, a case unprecedented in its local history. From early in the morning, the Madison County Courthouse was packed. Hundreds of people from all over had come. They wanted to witness justice being served to the 2 perpetrators of an unforgivable crime. In the dock, Mark and Laura Peterson were led in. Both were gaunt and haggard after months in custody. Mark, the cold-blooded mastermind, stood with a sullen, emotionless expression, his empty gaze fixed on the floor. Laura, his accomplice wife, cried ceaselessly, trying to perform her final act as a weak, misguided woman. The most painful and haunting detail in the courtroom that day was the row of seats reserved for the victims' families. It was completely empty. The 3 ill-fated children were all orphans, with no parents, no relatives. The only people in the world who should have been their family were the 2 individuals standing in the dock. That emptiness was the most powerful and silent indictment of the Petersons' monstrous crime. The trial began. The prosecutor started by reading the indictment. The entire horrifying conspiracy was recreated in detail, from their scouting of social service centers for potential victims, to the signing of insurance policies, and finally, the cruel staging of the accidents. The presentation of evidence left the 2 killers no room for denial. The first witness called was David Miller, the insurance adjuster. With calm professionalism, he recounted the entire process of how he discovered the deadly pattern and the anomalies in the insurance policies that led him to uncover the crime. Next, physical evidence was presented. Close-up photos of the intentionally stripped electrical wire, the fragments of the doctored wooden well cover. The forensic experts' reports confirmed that these were acts of deliberate sabotage, not natural occurrences. But the most damning evidence was the financial analysis. An expert from the Economic Crimes Unit presented a detailed money flow chart to the court, exposing the couple's vicious cycle: crippling gambling debt, adopting a child, buying insurance, murdering the child, collecting the payout, throwing the money at gambling, and starting the cycle anew. The numbers, which do not lie, laid bare the most naked and vile motive for murder. When recordings of their own confessions were played, especially Mark Peterson's cold, detached voice detailing how he pushed Ethan into the pond, lured Jacob to the well, and set the electrical trap for Daniel, a stunned silence fell over the courtroom, punctuated by gasps of outrage. During questioning, both Mark and Laura admitted to their actions. However, the blame game continued. Laura insisted she was a passive victim, forced and threatened by her husband. Mark countered that Laura was a willing participant, even suggesting parts of the plans. The closing arguments were tense. The defense attorneys tried to grasp at the last straws of mitigation. They argued that their clients' actions were driven by a gambling addiction, a social disease. They claimed the defendants had confessed sincerely, showed remorse, and pleaded for the court's mercy. In response, the prosecutor delivered a powerful and sharp rebuttal. Addressing the court, the prosecutor's voice rang out, arguing that no addiction, no debt, could be used as an excuse to justify the act of taking another's life, especially the lives of 3 innocent children. The defendants were not victims of gambling, the children were the victims of the defendants' greed and inhumanity. Their actions were an organized crime, with discussion, planning, and assigned roles. The defendants exploited the state's humane adoption policies, exploited the trust of society, to turn orphans, the most vulnerable among us, into tools for their own profit. This, he declared, was an act that trampled on every moral foundation, an insult to humanity itself. He stated that the defendants' sincerity only appeared when their crimes were exposed and did not show true remorse. Their crimes were unforgivable, and they were beyond rehabilitation. With that, the prosecution requested the court to impose the most severe sentence allowed by law on both defendants. After the arguments, both were allowed a final statement. Laura Peterson, through her final crocodile tears, tremblingly apologized to the children she had murdered, to society, and begged for a chance to live. Mark Peterson, the cold-blooded mastermind, was more composed. He stood before the court, not crying, and said only one short, monotone sentence, devoid of emotion. He stated that he knew his crimes were unforgivable and that he accepted whatever punishment the law provided. His attitude showed a hardened soul, a complete loss of humanity to the very end. The trial concluded its arguments. The judge announced the jury would deliberate. The entire courtroom waited. The final verdict, the judgment of justice for the two demons disguised as parents, was about to be delivered. After more than an hour of deliberation, the jury returned to the courtroom. The entire room stood in absolute silence, the air so tense one could hear a pin drop. All eyes were on the judge, who was about to deliver the final verdict, deciding the fate of the couple who had committed one of the most heinous crimes imaginable. Mark and Laura Peterson were led back to the dock. Both were trembling, their heads bowed, daring not to look at anyone. The judge, in a solemn and steely voice, began to read the verdict. He began by stating that after a comprehensive and objective review of the entire case file, the evidence examined at trial, as well as considering the arguments of the prosecution, the defense, and the defendant's testimony, the court had found sufficient grounds to conclude that the actions of defendants Mark Peterson and Laura Peterson constitute the crime of murder. The court completely rejected the defense's argument that the defendant's actions were driven by a gambling addiction. The judge explained that while gambling addiction is a social ill, it cannot be considered a mitigating circumstance, and it certainly cannot be an excuse for the act of taking another's life, especially the lives of children. The defendants were fully aware of their actions. They planned and executed their crimes consciously and with calculation. The judge's voice grew sterner, emphasizing the nature of a crime that had trampled on all moral foundations. He declared that this was an organized crime, with close consultation, conspiracy, and assigned roles. The defendants had exploited the state's humane policies on adoption, the trust of social service agencies, and the entire community to turn orphan children, the most vulnerable beings in need of protection, into tools to commit their crimes, a means for profit. This act, he said, is not only a violation of criminal law but is an affront to humanity, a brutal trampling of the sacred duty of parenthood. The actions were repeated over several years, with 3 different victims, showing a determination to carry out their crimes to the end, a hardened nature, and a complete loss of humanity. Each life taken was meticulously calculated by the defendants, staged as a flawless accident to deceive the authorities. The defendants' crimes not only took the lives of 3 innocent children but also destroyed society's faith in the goodness of humanity. The court found the crimes of the defendants to be unforgivable. The level of cruelty, depravity, and inhumanity shown by the defendants meant they were beyond the possibility of rehabilitation. It was necessary to apply the strictest penalty, to permanently remove both defendants from society to ensure general deterrence and maintain the order of the law. For the foregoing reasons, the court hereby sentenced defendant Laura Peterson to death for the crime of murder, and defendant Mark Peterson to death for the crime of murder. 2 death sentences were pronounced. Upon hearing the final verdict, Laura Peterson let out a crazed shriek before fainting and collapsing to the floor. Mark Peterson, however, merely closed his eyes for a moment, his face impassive, showing no change in expression as he accepted his final sentence. From the gallery, there were no tears from relatives, only quiet applause and sighs of relief from the citizens who had attended. Justice had finally been served for 3 little souls. The trial ended. The case of the murder of 3 adopted children for insurance money had officially closed with 2 appropriate death sentences. Days later, in his office, Detective Sergeant Marcus Thorne sat alone, looking over the entire case file. He was not thinking about the depravity of the 2 killers, but about the person who had started this investigation, David Miller, the insurance adjuster. To him, this case was a special testament to the fact that heroes do not always wear a police uniform. If it were not for Mr. Miller's caution, his acuity, and above all, his professional conscience, the crimes of Mark and Laura Peterson might have continued. Perhaps they would have adopted a 4th child, a 5th, and the deadly pattern would have repeated itself. Mr. Miller could have easily signed off on the file, perhaps collected a commission, and turned a blind eye. But he did not. He chose to follow his instincts, to bravely report the matter despite the risks and complications. His silent action saved potential future lives and was the starting gun for the journey to find justice. This case is a painful lesson on the depravity of man when consumed by a gambling addiction and bottomless greed. Mark and Laura Peterson did not just kill 3 children, they killed the very essence of parenthood. They turned the family home, which should be the safest of havens, into a slaughterhouse, a stage for their crimes. The facade of benevolence they worked so hard to build only makes their crimes more abominable and despicable. But the greatest tragedy, the most haunting aspect of this case, is the fate of the 3 children. They came into this world in misfortune, abandoned, with no relatives. They once had a glimmer of hope when they were adopted by a family, but then the very people who called themselves parents ruthlessly turned them into tools, pawns in the game of life and death. They died without ever knowing why, killed by the very hands that should have protected and loved them. The empty seats for the victims' families at the trial will forever be the most powerful, silent indictment of this unforgivable crime. Justice has been served, but the questions the case leaves behind will linger. About the loopholes in the adoption process, about society's responsibility to protect vulnerable children, and above all, about the bottomless abyss of the human heart, where with just one misstep, a person can become more cruel than any demon.